Hello, I'm Bill Serban, Director of the Center for Advancing Teaching and Learning at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse. This presentation examines research findings on the effectiveness of different learning techniques to identify techniques that can improve student learning and others that may have little or no effect in helping students learn. By the time students reach college, we expect them to be able to regulate their own learning. One of the most basic aspects of self-regulated learning is using specific learning techniques to acquire, understand, and remember new material. For example, a student may study for a test by reading the assigned material and then rereading it. Or the student may read the material and underline or highlight portions of the text. And another approach might be to read the material and then create a concept map of it. This table shows the types of strategies used by undergraduates at a highly selective university. As you can see, these students use a variety of techniques, but clearly prefer rereading notes or the textbook as their number one strategy. These are all commonly used learning techniques by college students, but we have to wonder whether some are better than others. Which ones are likely to be most effective? Are some ineffective? If we know which learning strategies are most effective, can we teach or persuade students to use them? There are hundreds of studies on learning techniques, but few attempts to determine the relative effectiveness of various strategies. Individual studies usually compare the effectiveness of several techniques, such as whether rereading material results in better learning than note-taking. However, in 2013, a group of researchers examined the research on 10 common learning techniques and developed a procedure for ranking their relative utility. Let's look at the criteria the researchers used to make their judgments. They examined the techniques with respect to 4 critical variables. 1, they looked at learning conditions, whether students worked alone or with others, read or listened to material, had access to resources while they learned, or not. Second, they looked at student characteristics, differences in students' ages, ability level, motivation, background knowledge, and the like. A third factor is type of material students tried to learn. They looked at whether students tried to learn lecture content, simple vocabulary, narrative or expository text, visual material, and so forth. And then last, they looked at how learning was measured, whether students had to recall information, whether they had to write an essay, or take some kind of recognition task, such as a multiple choice test. After reviewing the research on each technique, they assigned an overall assessment based on its relative utility, low, moderate, or high. A high utility rating means that compared to the other techniques, there is robust evidence across the 4 criteria. In other words, a high utility technique improves learning for a variety of students in a variety of circumstances with respect to different subject matter and materials as measured in a variety of ways. A technique may receive a low utility rating for a number of reasons. There may be insufficient or conflicting evidence about whether it improves student learning, and there may be limited evidence about the conditions or students for which it works well. You may want to pause the video on this table to review the descriptions and ratings of each technique. To explore some of the key principles related to learning techniques, let's compare 2 techniques, rereading and practice testing. Many studies with college students have included both techniques. And let's start with rereading. Rereading is used widely by college students and may be a primary mode of learning for most of them. Rereading does have a positive effect on student learning, but one that is limited compared to other techniques. One early study depicted in this graph found that the greatest improvement from rereading came between the initial reading of the material and the first rereading, but there was no improvement from the second to the 4th rereading. You can understand why rereading may appeal to students. It is relatively easy to use, a kind of repetition, and consistent with the belief that repetition is essential for learning, and for unskilled learners, it may be the only strategy they know. According to researchers, rereading may work because the student, 1, adds new information each pass through the material, and 2, may identify main ideas and reorganize the material. But why then is rereading a weak learning technique? It seems that to be most effective, rereading depends on careful consideration of the meaning of text. Students must monitor their understanding and recognize with each pass through the material what they know and don't know. Unless students allocate more attention to unlearned material, they run the risk of learning nothing new with each rereading. Moreover, as the text begins to look more familiar, students may assume they know it. Instead of processing it deeply, they may do the opposite, assuming because it is familiar that they already know the material. On the surface, rereading looks like simple repetition, but to be effective, rereading may require progressively more strategic processing that students fail to use. Let's look at practice testing. In research studies, practice testing is also referred to as retrieval practice. It involves a kind of self-testing in which students try to retrieve or remember what they learned previously. Practice testing does not refer to actually studying tests, nor does it refer to being repeatedly tested in high-stakes graded circumstances. Research indicates that many fewer students use practice testing spontaneously than other techniques, and that they view practice testing as actually ineffective compared to other techniques. Why is it less popular than, say, rereading? Practice testing is inherently more effortful than rereading. Trying to remember something you read previously is more difficult than rereading the material. Another possible factor is that during retrieval practice, students may conclude that they aren't learning much or getting much out of the experience, especially if they have difficulty recalling the material. But as the research indicates, retrieval practice is actually quite effective. This graph depicts typical results. College students who use practice testing can consistently outperform those who use rereading. This particular study showed that students not only remembered more factual information, but they better understood concepts and were better able to answer inference-based transfer questions. Why does practice testing work so well? Practice testing may seem counterintuitive. Why would trying to remember what you studied previously result in better learning than actually going back and trying to relearn the material? At this point, there's not a definitive answer to the question, but researchers have focused on several possible explanations. One is that retrieval practice involves students in making additional connections between concepts, and that these become retrieval cues for future recall. In other words, students' representation of the material becomes more enriched, and they have more ways to retrieve the information when needed. Another factor is that research shows that practice testing is more effective when students receive feedback. We can speculate that feedback might be especially effective as students are actively working through the topic and may see the relevance of the feedback they receive. For example, suppose I try to remember a concept and can't quite get it. Salient feedback at that point can help me clarify the idea. A third factor, which actually has not been studied in research on retrieval practice, focuses on what students might do after retrieval practice. So when students practice testing, it may highlight what they do not yet know very well. Students may then go back to the material and fill in the gaps in their understanding.